This was the end, or rather, the beginning of the end. The beauty was no longer sure of anything, but her intuition told her she couldn't back down now. Actaeon's second awakening had begun, and that only meant trouble. The room was full of control stones, but they couldn't suppress the young man's power and were constantly shattering. The sound of explosions tore at the girl's soul, and reason screamed at her to get out of there, but she couldn't just leave Actaeon to suffer alone and walk away. So she clung to his shoulders like a lifeline, hoping he would come to his senses. It didn't help much, but the girl didn't give up, even as crystals mercilessly pierced her body. She was running out of strength to hold on and fight for the both of them, but at some point, Actaeon heard her voice. The man knew he needed to pull himself together, but it proved to be extremely difficult. It was then that the blonde girl knew it was time for more drastic measures, but her mind went blank. If she gave up, Actaeon would be done for, and she would have to live with the guilt. Then her gaze fell on his ruby brooch. It was a way out, but unfortunately, she had noticed the damn thing, and now it was too late to run. It would be a real tragedy if she died to save him. Hyacinth would be left all alone and would hate Actaeon with his entire being, and Actaeon's life would become even more of a hell than it already was. So he had to hear her and snap out of it right now. But nothing happened. This was the last resort, and she really didn't want to do it. But she had to. A kiss, that's what she was going to do. But if Actaeon started demanding she take responsibility for it, she would personally beat him to a pulp. After a long second, their lips met. As it turned out in this fantasy novel, there was a cool concept called the Awakened. Some of them would discover they possessed completely unexpected magical talents. But there were also guides who could prevent the magic of these Espers from going out of control. Espers were highly valued in every country and used as weapons in times of crisis. The Vargas Kingdom was always searching for these people, and after their first awakening, they would be sent to a special academy. There, they would be pushed toward a second awakening and raised to be either Espers or guides. And the protagonist wasn't just idly chatting about this. She had actually transmigrated into this very novel. What's worse, it happened during her classmate's second awakening. As if that wasn't bad enough, she was supposed to die during the second awakening of an S-class Esper. And that Esper was none other than the Duke's illegitimate son, Acten. Like many male leads in romance novels, this guy was traumatized both physically and mentally. And this whole traumatic incident wasn't an accident. It all started with an extremely terrible event. He slowly began to lose control until one day he found a complete stranger. It turned out the girl's name was Milia, and she was an S-class guide. Their relationship became a little more than professional, if you know what I mean. Wouldn't it be great if the story ended there? Nope. The main villain was Lily's younger brother, who was bent on taking Actaeon's life because of what happened to her. It was then that the instructor noticed something was off with Lily. The girl was just spacing out, but then she wanted to confirm something. Guiding is just holding hands, right? It was supposed to be, but for some reason, the instructor told her to come to her immediately if she felt anything strange. A guide's health was no joke, especially since their numbers were far fewer than the Espers. This meant her body was national property. And there was one more thing she couldn't forget. After all, the world of this novel was a cruel one. So Lily was glad she remembered everything and wouldn't die a pointless death again. After that not-so-pleasant incident, she decided to check the date and time, and what she saw on her bracelet was not good news. Acten was supposed to show up at the academy in 6 months. To avoid losing her life, she needed to get a grip and clarify her immediate goals. All right, first things first, she submitted a leave of absence request to go home. Her physical and mental condition were fine, but after waking up, she really wanted to see her younger brother. Since they had no other relatives, Hyacinth had been living all alone. After graduation, she would be dispatched to the garrison, so this was her only chance to spend time with him. The professor wasn't a complete devil and approved her leave. Lily didn't believe a word of the instructor's goodwill, but she thanked her anyway. You see, any guiding was forbidden outside the academy walls, and that bracelet would snitch on you to the higher-ups. Lily knew this and promised to be a good girl. After their talk, she headed straight for the train station and hopped on a train bound for the county of Lorraine. On the way, she kept thinking about how to rewrite her fate in this story. Maybe she could avoid all the danger zones from the start. For instance, her younger brother was living with a noble family as a potential awakened. The problem was that the Count of Lorraine was a terrible guardian. He was basically bullying Hyacinth, trying to force his awakening. The Count laid hands on the kid every day, while his own son just stood by and watched. This was what caused him to become psychologically twisted and make all the wrong choices later on. Eventually, he would become a villain who pulled the strings from behind the scenes. Look, she wasn't particularly fond of the Count's family or anyone, but she didn't want Hyacinth to suffer his whole life. That's why she was here to see her brother today, but they wouldn't let her in, saying everyone was busy. But a lovely courtyard keeper was completely smitten with Lily and offered to ask about her brother for her. Luckily, he thought she was a relative of a staff member and was still hitting on her, or things could have gotten complicated. Besides, while the masters were busy, he was willing to give her a tour of the mansion. Just had to be discreet, you know what I mean? So far, so good, and the conversation was just small talk. The trouble started when Lily made up a name for her brother that the guy had never heard of. Despite that, the guy kept flirting and even offered to guess Lily's name, though she doubted he could. But when the guy guessed her name was related to a flower, she was completely stunned. Suddenly, she wasn't so interested in playing this game anymore, especially after the girl spotted something strange over by the gazebo. The guy immediately got nervous, saying it was just a training area and they'd better stay away. It was obvious that was where the Count and his son were abusing Hyacinth in the name of training. Lily wasn't about to stand by and do nothing, so she ignored the courtyard keeper and walked straight toward the gazebo. A few minutes later, she reached her destination, and the sight that greeted her was horrifying. The Count was beating Hyacinth with a stick, clearly deriving some sort of twisted pleasure from it. The boy was a shadow of his former self. His hair was dull and brittle, and his body was completely emaciated. Yes, they taught all guides at the academy to control their emotions, but right now, that control was on thin ice. So she swallowed a special pill and felt pure magic surge through her body. Just then, the Count sensed something behind him and turned around. Fear twisted his pale face into an ugly grimace. He had no idea how an Esper could have appeared in his home. Luckily, he hadn't realized his mistake yet, and Lily was getting a thrill from his fear and confusion. But Hyacinth immediately recognized his sister. Meanwhile, Lily zapped the guy. Not too hard, but she did zap him. The reason was simple. No one touches her brother. Now, the Count's son was getting hurt. Honestly, the guy was fine. A little shock like that never killed anyone. Yes, the Count was alive and crying and screaming his head off from the pain. He even started begging Lily for mercy, just wishing she would stop. It was then that Hyacinth noticed his sister's wrist. The stone was glowing hotly. The signal must have already reached the inspectors. This meant they would throw her in prison, and her brother would have to survive on his own. Just then, she saw the Count and his guards running toward them. Her rejected suitor had ratted her out. The inspectors surrounded the siblings. They had received a signal of unauthorized magic use. Liliopa wasn't going to make excuses. She was ready to face whatever came next. But she had one request for the inspector, the one who was supposed to protect potential awakened. She wanted to file a formal complaint against everyone in the county of Lorraine for abusing a potential awakened. Furthermore, they had systematically tortured and humiliated her brother. The Count was not happy with this turn of events. He didn't think he'd done anything wrong, and besides, the girl had attacked and injured his son first. She was the one who should be locked up. The guards listened carefully to everyone, but remained silent. The man understood that Liliopa had good reason for her actions, but she had still broken the law. Even so, the guard placed the Count and his son under house arrest to investigate her accusations. If the Count was found guilty, he would lose his title, be thrown in jail, and could even face capital punishment. After all, every potential awakened was the property of the state, not someone's personal belonging. But the Count was apparently fearless, for he had touched something that belonged to his majesty. Regardless, he had to take Liliopa into custody. The girl didn't resist, but she felt her brother was in a much worse state, so she tried to calm him down. But it was no use. The guy was terrified and could barely hear what his sister was saying. Lily herself was on the verge of breaking down. And just like that, she passed out. What Liliopa did might have seemed stupid, but she had thought it all through. Except things went sideways at some point, because she woke up to find herself staring at this kingdom's prince Isidore. Strangely, he started telling her that he could only become king after his older brother died. It makes you wonder if he already knew that Hyacinth was his brother's child. The guy was smiling, but he wasn't joking. He was curious about Hyacinth's supposed rank, even though it's actually impossible to determine for a potential awakened. Isidore had heard that such cases were possible, so he dismissed the girl's excuse. More importantly, he was convinced that Hyacinth was exactly that kind of case. He tried to convince Lily that he wouldn't use her brother, just help him. Liliopa didn't really buy his story. The prince went on to point out that the girl's actions were suspicious. When she took leave to see her brother, it was entirely possible she had found out he had awakened as an Esper and rushed to his side. Plus, she knew the guy was being treated unfairly and thought things would get worse if he stayed with the Count. Liliopa herself was a B-class guide. Nothing special, but not exactly weak either. It was enough to handle most missions, but her main goal lately was to protect her brother. All in all, his words would have made sense if Lily weren't a transmigrator who only cared about her new life. Meanwhile, Isidore announced that he would be transferring Liliopa and Hyacinth to a new guardian family. What's more, the Count would be stripped of all his assets, a portion of which would go to Hyacinth, and the girl would be released. This was all great, but it didn't lessen Liliopa's distrust of the prince. As soon as Isidore left the room, a guide would come to take her to her new guardians. The Bronte family wasn't the worst choice, and they were much better than the Lorraines. Then it hit Liliopa. They were talking about the ducal family, the father of the male lead, Acten. She wanted to scream because she was supposed to die at the hands of this very family. In the future, the prince left and Liliopa was released. Suddenly, Hyacinth met her in the garden, looking much better. He was really worried about his sister, realizing that if it weren't for the prince, things could have gotten very bad very quickly. He was just sulking, which was a little hurtful. You know, he could at least call her sister for appearance's sake. But the guy was too lost in his own world, worried sick about Lily, for any of that to seem important. Lily understood, though, and told her brother to calm down, saying she was fine. Their brief, tender moment was interrupted by Blair, the butler from the Bronte estate, who had come to escort them home. They had no choice, so the siblings followed the butler toward the Duke's mansion. The place wasn't just big, it was enormous, which meant the owner was filthy rich. Now Hyacinth was starting to understand what Blair meant. He was glad the kids hadn't dragged along a bunch of junk he'd have to carry into the house. It was then that Lily realized the butler was playing a game. He was smirking at his sarcastic words to her brother, confident he could break him. But there was no way she was willingly handing her brother over to this family. So her plan was to make the Duke let his guard down, then flee the country with her brother. Until then, she had to keep the big shots away from Hyacinth, especially Crown Prince Sibyllin. Because in the story, after the kid lost his only guardian, he deliberately approached him, filled his head with garbage, lured him in with sweet talk, and in the end, the kid died. Yes, they had avoided him so far, but for how long? It would be best to go to the academy together. And, generally speaking, Hyacinth's first awakening wasn't far off. But it wasn't that simple. For that to happen, there needed to be a reason, a trigger. Then they walked into the house, and, as if on cue, immediately ran into a gloomy Acteon. Blair immediately told him the paperwork took longer than expected, so they were a little late. Meanwhile, Lily looked at the guy and realized he exceeded all her expectations. His every move and word were precisely calculated. Most importantly, he was breathtakingly handsome. If it weren't for their bleak future, Lily would have pounced on him right then and there. But no, that would be stupid. Still, basic courtesy was in order. So she took the initiative and introduced herself and her brother to Acteon. Acteon listened intently, but said nothing. He just told Blair to take them to their assigned rooms. This was more or less the reaction Liliopa had expected. They weren't going to be friends, at least not now. Hyacinth, on the other hand, was unhappy with the cold reception and didn't want to be stuck here. Hyacinth was about to act out when someone called Acteon's name. How could Lily forget him? Let's just say he was no ray of sunshine. Acteon's older brother had just returned home. Not only was he super sensitive, but he also constantly talked trash to everyone. But Milia had managed to whip him into shape, so he was attached to her like a puppy. Every word he spoke was filled with arrogant malice. He could understand why his younger brother was working so hard for the House of Ortiz. Acten, on the other hand, remained calm and told his brother to get ready for dinner, because the Duke wouldn't tolerate it if his eldest son skipped dinner, even if he didn't want to be with the guests. A pause, like a staring contest. It lasted a long time. Actaeon's brother broke first. He figured that since their father took Hyacinth in, he must be destined for a high rank. But he couldn't figure out why the B-class Liliopa was living in their house. The siblings exchanged a look. Neither of them liked this arrogant noble. The protagonist understood, though, that the Duke's sons were likely fighting for power in the duchy, as the heir here was determined by awakening rank. And let's not forget what happened to Cassiel's twin sister, Claire. Liliopa thought Actaeon would lose control after that, but he remained composed as if nothing had happened. A little later, everyone was gathered around the table. The Duke started by saying His Highness predicted a great future for Hyacinth, and Lily tried to tactfully change the subject. But it was no use. The head of the house was well aware that since the siblings were here, they needed the help of a high-ranking Esper. At the same time, he wasn't exactly thrilled that Lily had to live in his house. She didn't want to be here either. But the Duke was an S-class Esper, despite the rampant rumors about his affairs. Normally, when an Esper and a guide marry, they imprint on each other. In this ceremony, they could tune their magic to the characteristics of their partners, allowing for ideal guiding. But this all had a downside. Ideally, guiding could only happen between partners. Yes, but the Duke thought he was above it all, never soul-bound with the Duchess, and cheated on her. Actaeon was caught in the crossfire of that mess, lost his mother, and spent his life walking on eggshells around the Duchess. The Duke had no intention of cleaning up the mess he'd made. His second son was just a tool to him, nothing more. He was just as awful to the Duchess. He stole her from her fiancé and then fooled around with whomever he pleased. No wonder he didn't like Lily. She looked like someone who had squeezed her way into his house through her brother. All she really wanted was to leave that house, but she had to keep up appearances. So she said she was worried her lower rank might damage the reputation of such a prominent family. But regardless, her only goal was always to protect her brother, no matter where she was. In 6 months, she would graduate from the academy and then go to the garrison. She would be leaving this place for good. Until then, for the next 6 months, she would keep a low profile. Her words impressed the Duke. He almost wished she were an A-class. But Hyacinth wasn't happy with what his sister said. But no one paid him any mind. The Duke had said his piece and wasn't about to make any more small talk. His wife wanted to stay and chat, but his impatient gesture indicated it was time to leave. This sort of thing was normal for that family, but Liliopa was still a bit dejected. As soon as the parents left, Cassiel decided to chime in. The guy was his usual charming self, pointing out that even though she'd been quiet until now, she was just playing nice to get ahead. After that, she ignored him, thinking his nasty attitude stemmed from the whole Claire incident. Claire was his fraternal twin sister and the center of his entire world. She was too good a girl, so she hated her powers and having to kill. Over time, her condition worsened, and at some point, her mind couldn't take it anymore and broke. Her powers went berserk, and after killing her guide, the girl died too. Cassiel lost a part of his soul, while Actaeon lost the only person who was ever kind to him, watching her die with his own eyes. The pain changed the brothers forever. Liliopa was so deep in thought that she no longer heard Cassiel calling her name. So now he was radiating palpable anger and negativity, making no secret of it, nor of his desire to kick the girl out of their house. Surprisingly, Lily thought the guy would have started trying to get rid of her sooner. He actually held back for a bit. But what she didn't expect was for Hyacinth to openly clash with Cassiel, saying that as far as he was concerned, the two families he'd stayed with were all the same. Then he grabbed his sister's hand and dragged her out of the dining room. Cassiel and Actaeon just watched them leave in silence. The older brother didn't pay much mind to Liliopa's words, while the younger one was mulling something over. Meanwhile, in a dark hallway, Hyacinth stopped. He wanted to know if Lily had intentionally pushed the Lorraines to this point. He couldn't believe that was her goal, because now she was being treated like trash right in front of him. Because if things kept going this way, he wouldn't want anything to do with his family. But the girl was sure her brother needed the Duke's support, and she wouldn't have to put up with these insults for much longer. Besides, her plan was to get Hyacinth into the academy within 6 months. The guy realized that's why she had come for him, since she hadn't written a single letter before. Now that things had turned out this way, they were better off staying together than going it alone. My brother has 3 months until he awakens, so they'll figure something out. Hyacinth just needed to trust his sister on this. Honestly, being ostracized in a place like this was business as usual for her, but her brother needed to be careful. Like we saw at dinner, the Duke is obsessed with rank. He couldn't care less if others live or die. Hyacinth just needed to protect her until he awakened, but she didn't want her brother to become a victim of this guy's schemes like everyone else. so it was best for the kids to stay away from this family's dirty business. Just then, Acteon appeared in the hallway, having overheard their conversation. From what he heard, the guy concluded that Liliopa knew a lot more about this place than she let on. Things were getting weird, so she sent her brother upstairs and prepared to talk to Acteon herself. The Duke's son desperately wanted to know how she knew so much about their family's affairs. He needed the truth now. The girl started telling a story based on rumors. Apparently, everyone at the academy was talking about an S-class Esper who had suddenly died on the front lines. Some believed a new S-class monster was to blame for the tragedy. Others were convinced it was the work of an assassin from another country, or even that she did it herself. Liliopa filtered out the most absurd rumors. Then it was possible to draw some reasonable conclusions. Besides, she herself could end up in a similar situation. After all, she wasn't very old, and they were pushing her to the front lines to deal with others. Acteon didn't quite follow her line of thought, because serving the country was the duty of every awakened. And the story really didn't sound like an excuse, so he advised her not to meddle. Yeah, Liliopa wasn't buying it, because decent parents would never send their own child to the front lines, under the guise of duty. But the Duke was hardly decent, and even Acteon was just spouting official lines about duty now. But it was different for her. Nothing was more important than her brother's safety. So she told him to stay out of the Duke's and his family's business, so they could prepare for whatever might happen. Honestly, Acteon understood her point, so he apologized for his outburst. Liliopa needed to be careful, though, because if the Duke or Cassiel overheard her, she could forget about her protection. But honestly, she didn't care one bit. In a place where she and her brother weren't even treated as human, she wasn't about to bow and scrape. Acteon just ignored them. His father and brother would speak ill of him at dinner, and even the maids were rude and wouldn't really help him. The whole thing bothered the guy, and he tried to explain his point of view to her. He acted that way because he didn't want to get too close to the girl and her brother. Unlike with Aaron, it was then that Liliopa realized he was probably talking about the guide who had died, which meant he was afraid she would meet the same end as his friend. So he didn't want to form close relationships to avoid getting hurt later. You could see it was getting harder for him to speak, so Liliopa suggested they stop, but it was too late. Acteon passed out. The girl didn't understand what was happening to the guy or why he had collapsed on her. Then it hit her. The guy was showing the first signs of his first awakening. This shocked her, as Liliopa thought this wasn't supposed to happen for a while, but it seemed she was wrong. The guy's condition was getting worse, but he struggled to hold on and told her to go get Blair. But Liliopa knew Blair couldn't help him. If he didn't want to die from a broken core right then and there, he needed a guide. So she asked the guy if there were any guides in the mansion, someone who could stabilize him. Acteon was silent, which meant Liliopa was the only guide in the mansion, and his life was now in her hands. But the fear that she would die right after him paralyzed him, preventing him from using her power. But the situation was really bad, and, as they say, desperate times call for desperate measures. She couldn't think about herself when someone was in so much pain right in front of her. She wasn't supposed to perform a guiding, and they might arrest her for it, but they wouldn't lock her up for providing emergency aid, right? The guy hadn't expected her to decide to risk her future to help him. But he shouldn't forget this day. And so, the guiding began. Liliopa was searching for the place where Acteon's magic was tangled, in order to untangle it. However, it wasn't magic, but Acteon's emotions. It was a cocktail of loneliness, isolation, a desperate craving for human connection, and pure fear. All right, Acten tried to break free, but it was no use. He needed her guidance, but something was wrong. Usually emotions don't sink like this during the process. But what's done is done, and they had to face it. She successfully unraveled the magic, but her own heart skipped a beat. Now Liliopa's consciousness was gradually fading. She couldn't believe that Guy's heart had absorbed her abilities in that instant. Acteon knew he had to break contact with Liliopa, but she was holding his hand tightly. What he feared most was that she would die, so he called for the medics. When Liliopa finally woke up, it was already morning. Hyacinth was bustling around the bedside. He was too worried about his sister because the girl felt terrible, so the first thing he did was get her some water. But it didn't help much, because when she saw Acten, she almost spat all the water on him. She didn't expect such a surprise, and that guy didn't expect such a strong reaction. Besides, the girl should have known that guiding at that time was a very bad idea. Liliopa's problem was unclear, the situation was critical, and there was no time to find someone else. If she hadn't intervened, Acten would have been dead by now. Hyacinth listened to their argument for a while. Then he cut in, because only he had the right to worry and be angry with his sister. Actaeon should shut up. They started a staring contest, which upset Liliopa, and she wanted to know what happened while she was unconscious. According to Hyacinth, nothing interesting happened. This was strange because the girl thought she would wake up in a confinement room, not her own room. That could wait. Liliopa needed to eat. She had been unconscious for 2 days. Since no one was going to tell her anything, the girl figured she should eat first, but the tension in the air didn't ease, and the room was much more luxurious than before. Had she become a noble in the past 2 days? It sounded too ridiculous. Just then, Actaeon spoke up, wanting to know how he felt when she fainted in his arms. Liliopa thought the guy was probably panicked and considering all the consequences, but everything was fine. But that wasn't entirely right, and the guy didn't really need to apologize. Liliopa wasn't going to listen to any more accusations, but she wouldn't refuse a simple thank you. And she was glad Actaeon looked healthy. She was scared that day, too. There was a reason for that. Headquarters said he would be a high level, and she could have been crippled or worse during the guiding. Liliopa probably knew this, but she had no choice. If she had stood by, the Duke would have made life miserable for everyone. Liliopa was lost in thought, not even noticing Actaeon kissing her hand and thanking her for saving him. This really annoyed Hyacinth, who didn't like that guy hitting on his sister. But as soon as Actaeon left her room, she asked her brother to leave too. She needed to think. Okay, she dodged a bullet this time, but the second awakening was coming, and what then? That was a big question. The novel said Melia awakened very late, so she couldn't perform the guiding during Actaeon's second awakening. Therefore, she needed the support of another high-level guide to prevent a total disaster. The decision seemed right, but for some reason, Liliopa felt very uneasy. In the evening, the protagonist received an unexpected visitor. Belladonna sent the Duchess to check on the girl's health. It's a wonder Liliopa didn't jump out of bed immediately to pay her respects to our guest. The guy suddenly threw her a curveball, asking if she liked riddles. Even though she said she didn't, he completely ignored her. He was very keen to know if she could guess who he was. At that moment, she thought he looked like an adult version of the second prince. The guy just kept pestering her to guess, saying he was bored to death. Well, it wasn't hard to guess from his appearance, demeanor, and skills. He was most likely a doctor or a pharmacist. Liliopa guessed right. He was a pharmacist, but he could get a doctor's license if he wanted to. Afterwards, he handed the girl some medicine to help her recover her strength. And it wasn't just ordinary medicine, but an enhanced version of Nishine. In these chaotic times, pharmacists were as precious as guides because they could make Nishine. Yes, that made sense. Even purified form magic could have nasty side effects, but not enhanced Nishine. Besides, only 30 people in the entire kingdom could make this stuff, so Beld was a pretty important figure. The guy told Liliopa to rest well today, because people like her usually don't listen to advice and end up in more trouble. He left after that, which made the girl very happy. Because she wasn't as well as she let on, she was coughing up blood, so she needed to get better as soon as possible. But things didn't go as planned, and Liliopa was bedridden for a week. Every morning Beld would come to check on her, wondering why she was recovering so slowly. He brought her new medicine every day, and finally, one day, she felt great. It was time to move on. As soon as she stepped out of her room, she heard her brother and Actaeon arguing, their voices getting louder. One moment she was enjoying the rare quiet, and now this crap was starting again. She couldn't refuse her brother's offer for a walk, and then Actaeon suddenly appeared and made the same request. The situation wasn't great, and suddenly, the young man asked her to wait a moment while he prepared a carriage. The problem was Cassiel had also decided to go for a walk today, but he was in a terrible mood. Interestingly, it was unlikely the guy had any interest in her, but if they met, it was hard to guess how he would react. Just then, she noticed Cassiel getting into a carriage. Well, that solved that. Now Hyacinth and Liliopa could finally go for their walk. Everything should have been perfect, but Actaeon wouldn't back down. He wanted to go with them, claiming he had important business. Besides, a lot of people had business to attend to today, so if they didn't want to wait until dark, it was best to all squeeze into one carriage. But the clever move of our eager suitor didn't impress Liliopa at all, which sounded like a direct challenge to his young and impetuous heart. Meanwhile, Liliopa was already at the bank, where she happened to run into His Highness. The man was curious and wanted to hear all the interesting details of the little trouble the girl had recently gotten into. Besides, the bank's luxurious reception area was perfect for a chat. I guess Isidore had a point, but running into him disrupted her already shaky plans for the day. Before this, Acteon had joined her and her brother and announced they would all go home together. They had just arrived, and as she walked into the bank, the prince suddenly appeared. Luckily, Acteon and Hyacinth had gone their separate ways, because if the three of them had met, it would have been a total disaster. The situation was still a bit tricky now, but manageable, though Isidore was really pressing her for details of what happened. Moreover, the guy had already read the report about Acteon's crazy first awakening and her guiding him. If she didn't want to talk, she didn't have to. It's a wonder if she went to the bank for the promised compensation or something else. Liliopa didn't deny it, and if she thought Isidore was done giving her a hard time, she was sorely mistaken. He was planning to take her out. His excuse was that he needed to learn about the commoner's way of life. Besides, thanks to him, she got some money, so she kind of owed him a meal. More importantly, the head chef who resigned from the palace had opened his own restaurant, and they could totally check it out. So it was time to slip away. The guy also hoped she wouldn't call him Your Highness while they were out and about. In that case, Mr. Isidore will be fine. To be honest, the girl wasn't very happy about it, but no one asked her anyway. Meanwhile, Isidore was playing the part of a nobleman in love, out on the town with his lover. Yes, that was an improper way to put it, so the prince backed off. Just then, Liliopa remembered her brother and Acteon were waiting for her, hinting to the prince that she already had plenty of company for the day. Isidore pretended not to get her hint. Meanwhile, Hyacinth was glaring at her. He had come to terms with Acteon being around, but this was a bit much. The first thing they did was grab a bite to eat together. His Highness paid for lunch, pretending it wasn't him who had the waitress pay for him. Liliopa felt the guy was up to something, and she wasn't wrong. He wanted a lot. He hinted that even if her brother was a high level, he wouldn't easily let that awakened who acted on his own off the hook. Then he put on a deceptively friendly smile and moved on. Liliopa suddenly realized what a strange mess she had gotten herself into. It was as if Isidore was toying with her, but at the same time, everything he did was to pull her to his side. The guy kept pointing out that he had helped her, but he didn't use it as an excuse to force her to do anything. As soon as the prince was at a distance, Hyacinth and Acteon approached the girl. Acteon told her to be careful with Isidore, that he wasn't as carefree as he seemed, so he would try to find out His Highness's true intentions. I guess we can go to the cathedral in the meantime. But Acteon tried to stop her because his brother was also going to the cathedral today. Even so, Liliopa was going to the cathedral now, even if she wasn't exactly thrilled to see Cassiel. After a while, they reached the temple. Everyone knew that most people in this country believed in the god of love and light, but they still treated the awakened as weapons. People came here to pray for their family members who went off to war. They also held final farewell ceremonies for fallen soldiers here. It was a cruel sight, one you could never really get used to. Liliopa and Hyacinth had also lost their parents because of this damn war. They grew up in a small town near the border. But when the war broke out, the magic of a powerful Esper wiped their town off the map. Liliopa and Hyacinth were the only survivors in their family. To survive, she did any job she could. It was then that her powers first awakened, and she eventually entered the academy. Hyacinth went to live with a count, and they were granted permission to place their parents' ashes in the cathedral. Today, they came to the cathedral together for the first time to visit their parents. Acteon walked behind them, constantly looking around, probably searching for his brother. She was about to tell him to relax, when he suddenly became even more anxious. His reaction made sense when Cassiel came into view. He spoke harshly, and knowing his brother wouldn't hold back, Acteon decided to protect Liliopa. But Cassiel didn't care, and just kept slandering Liliopa. He wouldn't even listen when she said she didn't come to the cathedral because of their sister. At some point, Acteon had heard enough of this nonsense, and told him he would one day regret his words. Acteon knew this from personal experience, because people can be seriously hurt by words spoken without thinking. He had felt terrible for saying things he regretted, and when Cassiel finally understood, he would feel even worse. Just then, Isidore calmly walked towards them. The guy saw Cassiel wallowing in his own pain, blind to the fact that others were suffering much more than him. And the only reason he calmed down now was because a big shot was talking to him. Because if he were B-class, the guy would have acted completely differently. Unsurprisingly, Cassiel started making excuses, but the prince didn't care. He asked Liliopa why she came to the cathedral. The girl didn't want to go into detail, but she answered that she and her brother were here to visit the urn of their late parents. Besides, she didn't understand why Cassiel thought he had the right to hurt others just because he was in pain. It's not like that guy had ever eaten rat soup or fled a burning city to survive, let alone lost his entire family before that. Every word pierced Cassiel's heart. He thought he was the only one in pain, that no one could understand his suffering. But she understood, yet she tried to move forward while he couldn't. Besides, he didn't need to prove his grief to everyone around him. Everyone already respected and acknowledged it. If you think about it, all of this was rather selfish of him. After that, Liliopa left. Realizing this was why she could never fall in love with the Cassiel from novel. After all, he needed tenderness and love to heal his wounded heart. No, she wasn't that kind of person. Her life had been too hard to afford any tenderness. Liliopa was thinking that next time, just the two of them should go to the cathedral. The girl started to wonder what the perfect date for another visit would be. But she couldn't finish her thought because she saw Acten and Cassiel near the carriage. The atmosphere between the two brothers was very tense. But what was even more outrageous was that Cassiel directly ordered Liliopa to get into the carriage at once. Hyacinth thought, who was he to give orders? I mean, a minute ago this guy was disrespecting his sister. But the young man's anger meant nothing to Cassiel, who simply ignored him. But ignoring his own brother was harder, and Acten wasn't about to let him be alone with Liliopa, because that guy needed to remember, well, the scene he caused at the cathedral. If he wanted to apologize, he needed to get the girl's permission first. But the guy just stood there in silence. So Liliopa took matters into her own hands. She started to get into the carriage, surprised to see the young man standing like a statue with no intention of getting in. So she had to urge him on so he would sit next to her. Meanwhile, Acten silently watched the carriage drive away. In the carriage, Cassiel admitted he was wrong, that he had been using his past as an excuse to run away from everything. That was all well and good, but she wanted to hear a simple apology. This prelude was way too long. Even so, she accepted his clumsy apology, but demanded he tell her about Claire, which shocked him greatly. To be honest, she wanted to get some information about Claire's guide, Arena, but she didn't dare ask directly. Cassiel was nervous, but he understood the curiosity of the person he was talking to. Basically, Claire was a genius who not only awakened her powers early, but also achieved S-class. The problem was they sent her to the battlefield too soon after that, and she suffered from increasingly severe auditory and visual disturbances every day. They threw her onto the battlefield because she possessed immense power, but even seasoned veterans found that kind of torment hard to bear. So you can imagine the toll it took on the psyche of an inexperienced girl who couldn't handle that kind of pressure. Cassiel now understood that even if you have monstrous power, it doesn't mean your mind is strong. Liliopa understood why Eren couldn't complete his mission. Everyone knew that Espers receive and utilize external magical power with their minds. That's why guiding can provide a controlled energy shock and stabilize an Esper's body. However, Claire's condition was caused by PTSD, not magical power, so Eren couldn't stabilize her. That's because no one in this world knew about psychological trauma. So the kid apologized to Liliopa, but he still had a big problem with guides. And this girl was planning to drag her own brother to hell, which in his eyes was just crazy. From an outsider's perspective, it probably was, as she was the sister of a potential Esper who had caught the attention of Isidore and Glock. But the real reason behind it all was much deeper, and this way it was easier for her to keep an eye on her brother. Just then, she realized that even if she saved Acten during his second awakening, it didn't mean everything would be smooth sailing, because, things could still go wrong. Would all her efforts to change the future fall apart? Was a great revolution the only real answer? If she couldn't just snap her fingers and start a revolution out of thin air. Just then, she turned her attention to Cassiel and said she had already forgotten his hurtful words. At that moment, the girl felt she needed to pull this guy to her side. So she started started saying that until they changed the laws, no one could escape the fate of being sent to the battlefield. The kid knew it himself because that's how the system worked, and Liliopa thought he had every right to be angry. She tried to explain that no guide was worth getting so worked up about, but it wasn't right to say Espers were the only problem either. Maybe the real problem was deeper, like the whole Magic Stone War. Ending the war was the right thing to do, but there was no guarantee another one wouldn't break out right after. So you could argue the real problem was the people who sent minors to the front lines. Cassiel was startled because the girl was saying some pretty dangerous things, and she looked dead serious. More importantly, if Hyacinth gained powers and was sent to war, she was determined to run away from here with him. This was all because Liliopa had decided she would protect her brother, even against the royal family. So she was willing to risk her life to escape, and the only reason she hadn't done so yet was the hope that she could actually change her destiny. A young man has to decide for himself how he wants to live, whether to stick to his beliefs or just walk the path the government has paved for him. At this moment, Cassiel was so stunned by what he had just heard that he didn't know what to say. But he was sure that once he returned to the academy, he would find the answers to the questions she raised, with her help. Meanwhile, the coachman announced they were home. The guy got out first and helped her down like a true gentleman. And if he couldn't handle it himself, the young man would be very happy if she could knock some sense into him from time to time. In that case, she hoped Cassiel wouldn't take his anger out on her. The outcome of this conversation and walk wasn't too bad, although the girl had expected a slightly different result. All in all, a whole month had passed since that conversation with Cassiel, and during this time, he had been showing interest in her, trying to make friendly conversation, which honestly wasn't too bad, and she hadn't stopped searching, but she had found nothing. It was time to go back to the academy, so Liliopa was back here on the very day she was supposed to die. She had spent the entire trip trying to find Milia, but just couldn't. She had even asked Beld about her, but that guy couldn't help her either. Now Liliopa realized Actaeon's second awakening would begin after the entrance ceremony, and she didn't want to bear this burden alone. For the past few days, she had been trying to compile a list of high-level mentors at the academy. The problem was all the top cadets were at the front lines. She couldn't figure out why it was so hard to find a way out, why either she or Acteon had to die. Suddenly, Cassiel noticed she looked terrible and thought he should go to Bell's to get her some medicine. But she just waved him off, and they turned their attention to Hyacinth and Acteon. Liliopa reminded them that since she was studying here, she just needed to report her return. Those two were supposed to go to the entrance ceremony, and Acteon asked if he could see her afterwards. Liliopa hesitated. She knew Acteon's second awakening would start at the end of the ceremony, so she agreed to the meeting. Afterwards, Acteon dragged a complaining Hyacinth into the hall. Just then, Cassiel admitted he felt something was off. Liliopa didn't expect him to be so sentimental, so she told him rather sternly to come with her to take care of the paperwork. They took care of things quickly, but for some reason, the girl felt exhausted. But she had to report to the dorms and then go to the entrance ceremony. She thought of Milia, who was supposed to start studying at the academy this year. It was possible the girl was on the run. This was bad news because she was still an S-class guide, and her life could be in danger. But the problem now was Acteon's second awakening, which was supposed to happen today. In the original timeline, after Liliopa died, one A-class guide and two B-class guides managed to stabilize the guy. Relying on Milia was also risky because her second awakening was later than everyone else's due to that incident. She was struggling to shake off those gloomy thoughts when Milia appeared before her like a ray of light. Well, things were getting interesting. Liliopa had been looking for this girl everywhere, and she had been at the academy all along. The girl suddenly blurted out that the stones in the Garden of O's weren't working properly. It was then that Liliopa began to realize the Garden of O's was specifically designed for abnormal awakenings. The question then was, why did someone die that time? Liliopa had been missing the point about the suppression stones. If they had been working properly, she might have actually avoided death. So she told Milia to go to the admissions hall, and she would report the problem with the stones to the lab. She needed to hurry and check everything, because there wasn't much time. The professor was very surprised to see a panicked Liliopa standing before her. The only thing the girl asked was whether the suppression stones in the Garden of O's were working. The question sounded very strange, especially coming from a cadet to a researcher. So she had to make up a reason, saying she felt some strange magical energy coming from the main hall. She thought these were signs of a second awakening, but they were different from usual. It was hard to believe this woman's wild story, and besides, Only an S-class guide could sense such a magical reaction from this distance, not a B-class. That made a certain amount of sense, but the question was whether this high-ranking official was prepared to take responsibility for the damage caused by an abnormal awakening. More importantly, all these signs were appearing in Acteon Branturn. Now the researcher wasn't smiling, because this guy's second awakening was supposed to be S-class. And there was the problem: the suppression stones had run out of energy after an A-class awakening that happened yesterday. At that moment, Liliopa realized that if the stones had been replaced in time in the original timeline, things would have turned out completely differently. Luckily, they at least had enough spare stones, and they could urge the workers to hurry. This was good news, and the girl was confident in her intelligence. So, if a miracle happened, she was prepared to take responsibility for her words. Now Acteon had to be taken to the Garden of Oaths, even though she was running towards her destined doom. After trying to push the guiding job onto others all this time, she wasn't afraid of her own possible death, but she was worried about Hyacinth's fate. I need to pull myself together and figure out what to do before the second awakening begins. One thing was for sure: the trustish-ridden Acteon wouldn't rush to ask for help even if he felt the signs of second awakening. So if Liliopa saw those signs, she had to get him out of the hall. It would be great if everything went smoothly, unlike in the original story. Just then, she was hit by a wave of natural magic. But no, it was more complicated. The magic was too aggressive, yet no one else felt it. Worse, Liliopa noticed Acteon's condition and was about to approach him, but Cassiel stopped her. But her eyes were locked on Acteon, who mouthed to her not to come closer. It was the last thing he did before losing consciousness. Liliopa couldn't wait any longer. She broke free and ran towards the guy. Luckily, the nearby teachers got to him first. It was clear this young man's awakening was not normal, so he needed a more thorough examination. Overall, Liliopa was glad the teachers were cooperating so well, which meant there was hope for a positive outcome. Just then, her brother came over and said Acteon had been acting strangely all morning. She wasn't stupid either. She had noticed the young man's condition earlier, but decided to pretend she hadn't. At that moment, a few more people ran over to help the professors in the hall. The girl didn't understand why all these people were fussing over the guy in the hallway. Time was running out. Just then, a crack appeared on the binding stone, and Acteon's bracelet shattered into pieces. This was a huge problem, so the professor told all the students still in the hall to get out of sight immediately, because this guy's magic was completely out of control. Liliopa saw the problem too. They hadn't gotten Acteon to the Garden of Oaths in time, and his second awakening had already begun. She knew if she started guiding him now, they might be able to save the boy. She didn't want to hear her younger brother argue that he didn't want her to go to her death, so Cassiel took matters into his own hands and rooted her to the spot. She woke up in the academy's courtyard with a sharp pain in the back of her head, which meant Cassiel had knocked her out. On one hand, she understood why he did it, but on the other, she still felt hurt. Even so, she realized she was in the plaza in front of the main building, where the professors and upper year guides had all gathered. What worried her was why the professors would summon students when guides had far more guiding experience than cadets. But the truly fatal part was that the highest-ranked guide currently at the academy was only a B rank. Just then, another professor appeared and said that Professor Hishian's magic was depleted. She was an A-rank guide, and even so, she had been powerless against an S-rank. Liliopa knew how tricky they were. Acteon's magic was crystallization. He could destroy everything around him, and the Garden of Vows wasn't functioning properly either. But she couldn't just stand there, despite the immense emptiness she felt inside. Just then, Cassiel grabbed her hand, not wanting her to go to her death. He pleaded with her to stay put and not do anything crazy, but she wouldn't listen at all. She knew very well that even in this situation, his father wouldn't recall the guides who worked for him. He knew this too. He knew a teacher had already been sacrificed trying to save his brother, so he didn't understand why Liliopa wanted to do the same. Besides, he knew exactly what would happen if she went. The power gap was just too wide. Liliopa was well aware that Acteon's magic could kill her, but she couldn't just abandon him to his fate. Moreover, Cassiel's actions were an insult to her as a professional. Her words sobered him up a little, and he demanded that she come back alive. If she kept her promise, he would grant her any request. With that, the conversation was over. Besides, she knew it was possible to guide him. Otherwise, he would have collapsed and been destroyed during his first awakening. Maybe there was something between them, but even so, this was a chance for them to mend their relationship. Meanwhile, the freshmen were still worrying about when they would be assigned to their dorms. But Milia knew the academy could turn into a total disaster zone at any moment. She worried if she had done the wrong thing by sending a stranger into what could be a very terrible situation. But she felt this time was different because the Liliopa she met for the second time was like a completely different person. She thought that the blonde girl was probably making the same heart-wrenching choice between saving herself and saving others, just like her. But the difference between them was that Milia had sent the girl into a desperate situation, knowing full well what the worst-case scenario was. She kept telling herself she couldn't intervene directly, and she was sure Liliopa could handle anything. Yes, she was worried they couldn't use the Garden of Vows at the time, but she still believed she had paved the way for Liliopa's work. But even so, the result was obvious. She had put the girl's life in danger. Just then, Hyacinth came up to her, noticing that Milia was trembling badly. He tried to calm her down, saying that nothing bad had happened, and even if it had, everything would be all right in the end. But Milia remembered clearly that this was the very man who, after losing his only sister, had turned into a cold-blooded monster whose gaze could freeze her soul. Looking at him now, she realized how kind he was, how much he cared for his sister, and how he was trying to soothe her and himself as well. The young man couldn't help but feel the girl's intense gaze. She claimed he just reminded her of someone she knew. Milia was more worried than anyone because she didn't want to see this good man collapse again under the weight of pain and guilt. So they both prayed to all the gods they knew that no one would die today. Meanwhile, Liliopa and two cadets were heading towards the Garden of Vows, replaying in their minds every detail they could remember about Acteon's second awakening. The problem was, these people had practically no real combat experience. At the same time, a professor explained that in a few minutes, the three of them would enter the Garden of Vows. They needed to remember that once they crossed the threshold of that building, they couldn't expect any backup. This had been made perfectly clear, so they needed to pull themselves together and move forward. The moment they stepped inside, they saw a vortex of Acteon's magic filling the entire space around them. The magic was so dense it felt like any exposed skin was about to split open. The senior female cadet decided to enter the room first to scout the situation. If everything was normal for the first second, the next, she was slammed hard against the wall by a wave of Acteon's magic. As Liliopa checked the girl's injuries, the male cadet panicked, turned, and ran, leaving the two of them alone. She kind of understood how he felt, but seriously, how could he just abandon his injured companion like that? Liliopa had to proceed with caution, as the guy knew he was dangerous to others and would push away anyone who tried to get close. After confirming the senior cadet could leave on her own, Liliopa went to find Acteon. Meanwhile, the young man was in terrible shape, both mentally and physically, his life hanging by a thread in the Garden of Vows. Acten had basically absorbed the magic of the entire academy. This had turned him into a full-blown ticking time bomb. Suddenly, in a corner, the girl saw the body of Professor Hetian, who had been trying to guide him earlier. Liliopa knew that if she didn't pull herself together, she would meet the same fate. But walking through those silent corridors was incredibly eerie. Finally, she saw Acten. He wasn't rampaging. Instead, he was unconscious. This was even better. An opportunity to stabilize him had presented itself. But his mental world was in chaos. Claire was holding Aaron's body and pointing a gun at him. It was then that Liliopa realized she was seeing the guy's memories. That day, Claire had given her stepbrother a piece of advice. Acten should never trust guides because none of them could handle monsters like them. Despite this, she still felt guilty for taking Aaron away from her brother, as Aaron had been closer to him than family. After that, she pulled the trigger and said goodbye to her life. Now, Acteon's behavior made sense. He had spent his whole life terrified of becoming like Claire. Her words were so deeply ingrained in his mind that he believed he was a monster. But that wasn't true, and Liliopa tried to make him understand that. All she did was trigger a magical rampage. Standing there being scared was useless, so she pulled herself together. She needed to bring him back to his senses. His mental world was under attack. She started to approach him, but he reacted to her movement by releasing his magic. And that was just the beginning. Acten would keep attacking until she backed down. She should have taken the chance to leave, but she couldn't abandon Acten. She managed to get close to the guy with great difficulty, but he didn't react to anything she said. But she didn't back down. she began the guiding, which had to be done through a kiss to get a positive result. In that moment, Liliopa saw Actaeon's memories again. Now, he was a little boy waiting for someone. The rain was pouring, but the child stubbornly waited for his mother, who had just returned from the front lines. Suddenly, the woman heard the Duke's voice, a voice she knew all too well. The guy hadn't come to their house alone. He had brought his men with him. He announced that the king had promised him she would not be sent back to the battlefield. Worse, his majesty had given Actaeon's mother to the Duke like a piece of property. They had some disagreements, but everything was settled when the guy put a ring on her finger. Just then, Actaeon erupted, throwing a punch at his father, but it was useless. His old man just kicked him away. Watching the guy's memories, Liliopa didn't understand why he was showing all this to her. The next memory was worse than the last. Actaeon's mom was captured and confined in the Duke's mansion. They let the children see her for an hour at a time, as if she were in a prison. Liliopa started to think the Duke was a real bastard, and his household was just as bad. No one spoke to Actaeon or even looked at him. It was like this day after day, year after year. People treated him like a ghost, even when he said his final goodbye to his mom. He was always alone, but one day, Aaron came to the house and immediately took an interest in the boy. But Claire didn't want Actaeon mixing with her guide, so he tried to keep his distance to avoid upsetting his sister. But Aaron wouldn't give up. Before they knew it, they had become friends, and for a short while, Actaeon was truly happy. Until that terrible day. Liliopa understood now. She understood why he had shown her those memories. He was afraid of becoming a monster and taking another person's life. Even though it wasn't his fault, the guilt was eating him alive. That's why she pleaded with him not to push her away, so she could ease his pain. Slowly, Actaeon's magic began to calm down, but the guy's impulses were just getting started. Liliopa gradually realized this was going far beyond guiding, so she had to use all her strength to make him let go and realize what he was doing. Afterwards, she had Actaeon help her up so she could go get help. Seeing Actaeon's reaction, Liliopa told him not to blame himself too much. What happened to the professor wasn't his fault. Then, Actaeon carried her out of the Garden of Vows. She was shocked that she had actually managed to guide the guy. Could her fascination with him be that strong? Meanwhile, they not only treated her injuries, but also re-evaluated her rank. It turned out she wasn't a B rank, but an S rank. Liliopa obviously wanted to rest, but because of the sudden rank up, no one would leave her in peace. At one point, she was so exhausted, she just wanted to go back to her dorm. But no such luck. Even the professors weren't ready to call it a day. It was no wonder, really. A B-rank guide had guided Actaeon, not only survived, but also ranked up. The more she thought about what happened, the stranger the whole thing seemed. Even in the original story, there was no plot line about Liliopa's rank changing. Meanwhile, the professors were arguing about how this could have happened. Maybe the ducal family had found a way to turn ordinary people into high-ranking sentinels? Liliopa was amazed that these intelligent people were seriously discussing such utter nonsense. But seriously, the children of the ducal family were exposed to the magic of high-ranking, awakened individuals from a young age, and the only way to get that kind of result was to be exposed to it, almost from birth. But that wasn't her situation, nor was it some kind of genetic mutation, as some nerd suggested. The most logical explanation was that she had somehow hidden her true rank. But that wasn't the case, because she had fainted during her first awakening while guiding Actaeon. And besides, saying she was part of some experiment was too far-fetched, right? So they decided to end the intense questioning for now and leave her alone. But when the professors let up, the students looked at Liliopa like she was the damn Loch Ness monster. So all day in class, she felt like a monkey in a zoo, with everyone staring and whispering but not daring to get close. Just then, Cassiel came over and asked how she was doing, when all she wanted was to crawl into bed and pass out. To be honest, the girl's feelings about Cassiel hadn't changed. There was an arrogance about him that was sure to attract big trouble in the future. But on second thought, she wouldn't have liked him even without that attitude. He was too focused on her instead of his own brother. So she wasn't in the mood to talk and just walked away. All those intense emotional reactions were a bit overwhelming, but that wasn't the real problem. She knew very well that the news of her rank change was spreading like wildfire throughout the academy, which meant the Duke probably already knew. It didn't take a genius to figure out that the guy was surely plotting all sorts of schemes to get her under his thumb. And he wasn't the only one. Actaeon would probably make a move soon too, once he was released from confinement. Worse, she knew that if she ended up like Actaeon's mother, his situation would become very dire. My God, Acteon might even be eliminated on some trumped-up charge of being a dangerous sentinel. She suddenly realized that Liliopa's old convictions were starting to waver. Before, the only thing that mattered to her was her younger brother. Lately, Acteon had been on her mind too much, disturbing her thoughts. So she wanted to make the guy happy, even if just for a little while. To do that, she needed to figure out a solution for the control bracelet, which apparently could be damaged by Sentinel's powerful magic. She needed to brainstorm a way to get rid of that thing. Meanwhile, Acteon was alone in his room, pondering the meaning of life. His isolation arrangement was rather fortunate, even though he knew he'd probably been marked as a serious threat. Just then, the door opened and the Academy's director walked in, the man who held the key to how long he'd be confined. The boy admitted he was satisfied with his current conditions and thanked the director for the preferential treatment. So much for pleasantries. The director confessed he hadn't come just to chat, but to confirm something, yes. The director was preparing to perform a guiding check on Acteon. The guy understood the director's intentions perfectly, but cooperating would be a very bad move for him. To confirm his suspicions, the director asked if the incident had caused Cadet Liliopa to somehow imprint on the young man. The boy started denying it outright, though his behavior indicated he was dodging the question. But that wasn't the case. The young man tried to convince the director that he was simply having a hard time accepting guiding right now. But the director refused to believe him because the reports said the guy was fine, which meant he was trying to get away with something. But the director's guide found that Acteon probably couldn't be stabilized because he was already in optimal condition in every respect. This was interesting, but this trait didn't prove that an imprinting hadn't occurred. In any case, the boy was about to be summoned by the authorities, where an investigator would check if he was lying. With that, the director ended the conversation. Acteon was glad he had at least solved one problem. Acteon had been afraid he would follow in his sister's footsteps, but that hadn't happened, and it was all thanks to Liliopa. He was surprisingly stable now. He understood now that if he felt that strange magic again, he wouldn't fly into a rage like he did at the entrance ceremony. More importantly, if he spent his life with Liliopa, he wouldn't become a monster. But he couldn't force her into a difficult life because of him. Most importantly, on that fateful day, the guy had unilaterally bonded with Liliopa, and the director wanted to confirm it. My old man is the type who's used to exploiting the awakened for his own benefit. He wouldn't like this. Everyone knew that a high-ranking S-class sentinel bonded to a specific guide couldn't receive guiding from other guides. To the royal family, this was inefficient. If anyone found out that Acteon had unilaterally bonded with Liliopa, they would be used as pawns in a backroom deal. So in a way, the guy was glad the bond was one-sided, though the outcome wouldn't have changed even if it were mutual. In the end, any guide other than Liliopa was meaningless to him. He clearly remembered she had a goal of getting out of here, so he intended to help her achieve it. Besides, he was sure that even if he became a monster, Liliopa wouldn't abandon him and would come to his rescue. So he planned to hide the mark for his entire life, because he never wanted to force a girl to do anything. But just as he made this decision, fate pushed them together again. She pulled him into a secluded spot where no one went to talk. The atmosphere was a bit awkward, considering how close they were standing. The girl knew the young man might be uncomfortable being with her, since they had been intimate just a few days ago. So she decided to steer the conversation in a safer direction and asked if his isolation was over. It turned out that as long as he didn't cause trouble, he was free to study at the academy. But Liliopa didn't share his good mood because she knew someone had tried to take him out at the entrance ceremony. She tried to make him understand that someone wanted to kill him, but Acteon was perfectly aware of it and also knew who was behind it. He saw the surprise on her face, as she had assumed he was completely in the dark. But he wasn't an idiot, not like everyone thought. The Duke supported Sibylline, but allying with their family was actually a bad move for His Highness. Liliopa suddenly realized that in the novel, Acteon took revenge on everyone not just for his mother, but for himself as well. Because in the book, Prince Sibylline was the one who started the war in the first place. He used him as a convenient tool to rally allies around him. In the novel, he messed up Acteon's second awakening and then pretended to protect him, to pull him to his side. The same thing happened to Hyacinth, whom he got rid of after he was no longer useful. He even helped Acteon become the head of his family. But but the guy saw through his twisted schemes and eliminated him. But that wasn't the end of the story. The noble faction still existed, and they were very unhappy with how things had turned out. Around the same time, Prince Isidore went missing, vanishing into thin air. With no one to take charge, the nobles seized control of the kingdom, and then all hell broke loose. So against the backdrop of everyone else's suffering, Acteon and Milia's happiness seemed out of place. Before all this, Liliopa didn't understand Acteon, but now everything was crystal clear. It was as if the entire kingdom was responsible for what had happened to him. That's why he sought revenge not just on his father and the crown prince, but on the whole damn country. His question pulled her back from her thoughts. He wanted to know if she was going to ask how he came to that conclusion. But Liliopa didn't need anyone to explain the obvious to her. You see, when Liliopa awakened, she not only felt his emotions but also saw his memories. It was quite intense, but Acteon hoped she wouldn't run off and report it to the school administration. But compared to anyone else, he didn't mind her doing so. Acteon's words and actions stirred some unexpectedly warm feelings in Liliopa's heart. Just then, Milia was hurrying towards them, so Liliopa had Acteon hide around the corner. Milia had discovered this place by chance, and sometimes when she needed a little peace and quiet, she would come here. That made sense, but Liliopa had a question for the girl. She wanted to figure out why the pink-haired girl wasn't surprised at all when Liliopa called her by name during their first meeting, and she knew there was something wrong with those stones and had even warned her. Milia trembled, saying she didn't want to lie to Liliopa, but she couldn't tell her the whole truth either. Even so, she would help Liliopa in any way she could. After that, the girl ran off, and Acteon came out of his hiding spot, frustrated that he and Liliopa had been interrupted. A professor had also called for Liliopa, but the guy believed they still had plenty of time to be together. It turned out the professor had some not-so-good news. The crown prince wanted to talk to her, and they couldn't ignore it, so she and Acteon set off for the capital. Before that, however, she learned from Cassiel that Acteon had also been summoned, and the Duke knew about it, so he had them stop by the mansion first. Sibylline probably wanted to pull her to his side, which was why he had called for her. This also meant the guy would leave Hyacinth alone for now. But it would be naive to think the crown prince wouldn't find a way to get what he wanted. In any case, she would find out the answer soon enough. But for now, it was time to leave the train station. But when they reached the meeting point in the square, there was no sign of a carriage. This had to be some kind of power play from Sibylline, but he certainly hadn't forgotten to send some watchers after them. Just then, she had an idea that would really show His Highness a thing or two. Acteon immediately understood her intention. They could blow this up right now. They exchanged a knowing glance, plotting something mischievous. So they split up, and just before the show began, Liliopa took her next pill. The spy chased the girl into an alley and then froze. She was gone. It wasn't surprising, as she was attacking him from the other side. Suffice it to say, his pride was hurt, and it felt rather embarrassing. She racked her brain, trying to figure out who had sent these guys to follow them. Her words thoroughly enraged him, especially since he couldn't tell her he worked for Sibylline. On top of that, she decided to use magic, call the guards, and hand over the culprit in the Duke's name. Basically, to make a mess for both him and the prince. But things went sideways, and the guy broke free. Liliopa gave chase, realizing the gunman was trying to mentally control Acteon. So now she had to catch the guy she'd let get away. They ran for a bit, but Acteon and Liliopa managed to catch the spies. After it was all over and the enemies were caught, she realized she had been too reckless. She had only meant to call the guards, but because of her, Acteon had to use his magic. Now his magic flow was all messed up. That's why she told him not to use any more magic, lest he exhaust himself. Just then, the guy noticed they were surrounded, probably by people from the administration department. He was right. First responders would arrive as soon as possible. It was crazy that one of the spies used a gun after knowing the man and girl's ranks. Well, he hadn't aimed for any vital spots, but he still pulled the trigger. This meant that no matter how badly Liliopa and Acteon were hurt, the important thing was that they weren't dead. Meanwhile, the police showed up, wanting to know one thing. What the hell happened here? It turned out to be an old acquaintance of the girls, the same guy who handled her case when the Count was attacked, and later, during Acteon's first awakening. This was the third time he'd been called out because of her, so he was going to give her a minute to collect her thoughts and then set the record straight. Liliopa didn't hesitate to accuse the men of being spies, saying she had noticed their suspicious behavior back in the square. She claimed the guys tried to approach Acteon, but when they were spotted, they tried to flee and she caught them. so she and the young man were just defending themselves. But the policeman wasn't so easily convinced. He felt a strong sense of déjà vu. Still, he couldn't ignore the situation, so he arrested the men accused of espionage. He couldn't just let Liliopa go, especially since this was the third time she'd pulled something like this. But she wasn't worried at all, and tried to reassure Acteon, since this was all new to him. A little while later, Isidore came to bail Liliopa out of jail again. The girl felt sorry that she hadn't lived up to His Highness's expectations. He hadn't expected her to cause such a huge mess. Well, he was used to the girl's behavior, but why hadn't Acteon stopped her? He was supposed to be a level-headed young man, yet he got swept up in this crazy scheme. Acteon, on the other hand, fully supported Liliopa, as he didn't see her actions as impulsive. On the contrary, he admired her thoughtfulness. The prince had come to terms with it, but he was annoyed that even after he helped them, the two of them still looked unhappy. Meanwhile, they were driving down a city street and noticed a group of citizens holding a demonstration to protest the war. The protests were getting more intense by the day, so people were starting to realize the control stones had brought nothing but discord to the nation. We could pretend the world wasn't falling apart and that no one was coming to save it. But what was the point? The sad thing was Liliopa would soon be a part of this whole mess. But lo and behold, His Highness sat in the car, completely unfazed, acting as if the protesters didn't exist. Meanwhile, Isidore couldn't ignore the fact that Acteon had questions for him, questions he couldn't answer. All he could do was hope for Acteon's reason and understanding. The girl suddenly noticed the mutual hostility between the two men. Could Acteon have sensed something suspicious about His Highness? It wasn't simple, because Isidore really didn't seem like a bad guy. Yes, he was eloquent, which rubbed some people the wrong way. Even now, it was hard to tell what the prince really meant. Did he think the protesters were right or wrong? Every word he said had a hidden meaning, so it would be hard to reach a consensus if he kept acting this way. He was very friendly to Liliopa, but he kept giving her reasons to doubt him. Digging into his background might be the right move to help us understand his motives. Soon, they arrived at the palace and headed towards the crown prince. She looked around, recalling fragments of the kingdom's history, when Isidore interjected that he had delivered them safely. But now he had to go. Liliopa thanked him for his kindness and help, and besides, the guy was curious and wanted to get involved, and he owed her a favor anyway. The expression on his face was truly strange and hard to read. Then he leaned into Acteon's ear and whispered something so that Liliopa couldn't hear. This was quite a turn of events, but Acteon had no intention of being deceived by His Highness's words or his games. Moreover, the lad was furious. He hadn't come here to be some prince's lapdog. Just then, Isidora's right-hand man called her over, as there was official business to attend to. So she left the young people to themselves. The whole thing was strange. Isidora had never shown any hostility towards people before, but this reaction was a complete overreaction. At that moment, she noticed the guy was clearly uncomfortable. The reason was that there was almost no magic here, or rather, the magic was severely depleted. So she decided to help the guy out and loosened his tie a little. But he was completely lost in the moment, not minding if Liliopa helped him with his tie every day. Just then, the crown prince's assistant approached and asked them to follow him. As they walked through the castle's corridors, all eyes were on them. Now, the moment of truth had arrived. They were standing before the crown prince. They bowed their heads before the crown prince, watching as the man conferred with his assistant. After being given permission to look up, Liliopa turned on the charm, thanking him for the honor he had bestowed. The man got straight to the point. He knew her brother was under the duke's protection, but her status would also be changing soon, so he offered to take her under his wing. However, Liliopa felt that the honor His Highness bestowed was too great for her to bear. Afterward, Cybele turned his attention to Acteon, asking how he felt during his stabilization period. The young man didn't hide anything, saying he couldn't put into words the range of emotions he was experiencing. This was getting interesting, so the prince ordered Oregon to remove their bracelets. The man wanted to test Acteon's power in real time. Liliopa didn't like this proposal, as she understood His Highness just wanted to use them for his amusement to entertain the nobles. To them, they weren't people, just lab rats. So the guy decided to start with Acteon. The problem was that the magic in the palace was depleted, which meant controlling the flow of magic would be an extremely painful affair. Since the lad was in no hurry to start his performance, Cybele began to provoke him. Judging by the guy's expression, the prince had completely gotten under his skin. The hall fell silent. The courtiers surrounded them, saying they should obey His Highness's command. Acteon just sneered, saying he had lost his composure for a moment, but unfortunately, he was going to have to disappoint the prince. Meanwhile, Liliopa kept an eye on the guy, knowing how easily he could be provoked. Then, Acteon finally summoned his magic. Apparently, he didn't show his full strength, which disappointed the crown prince a little, as he had been expecting much more. Nevertheless, it was enough for him to be sent to the battlefield. The lad decided to put on a show for everyone, pretending to be dizzy and losing control of his magic. The audience didn't expect this turn of events, nor did they expect him to intentionally lose control and shatter the palace windows. Everyone in the hall was terrified like little children. At that moment, the girl could see right through his act, so he should have at least given her a small scratch to make the performance look more realistic. Interestingly, during his second awakening, his power was unstable, and he could barely control his magic. But now, he could handle it perfectly without the bracelet. Meanwhile, people in the castle were screaming, running around, and begging for someone to stop Acteon. Just then, she asked him why he hadn't ended his one-man show yet. But Acteon remained silent, and Liliopa decided to play along with his act, pretending she couldn't stabilize him. This basically meant she didn't meet the crown prince's standards, so she wasn't qualified at all. To stop Acteon's rampage, Oregon had to approach and put the bracelet on him. Basically, what they did was seen as an attack on the crown prince, so they were taken away for interrogation and temporarily detained. 3 days passed in silence, and then, bang, they were released. She was worried that Acteon would be hurt after that 72-hour loyalty test. Liliopa also knew that the crown prince had an extremely strong sense of pride, so they called the whole thing an accident, making sure no one knew he had been bested by some awakened. This meant that retaliation would be coming soon, especially after they had so rudely refused his help. Just then, Acteon suddenly rested his head on her shoulder. He was happy to know that the girl actually cared about him, but she pushed him away, saying he was a bad boy who didn't listen to Annie Lilypop. The guy admitted he thought he could get away with it, which was why he did it. But that was all in the past now, because the girl was about to learn something about his father. It was hard to guess what the Duke would do, whether he would throw down the gauntlet to the crown prince, or more likely just ignore her and not try to stir up any extra drama. For now, though, it was all just speculation, so there was no point in guessing what would happen. They would find out when the time came. However, the Duke's proposal completely took Liliopa by surprise. He asked her to consider an engagement. The question was who was marrying whom, and when the big day would be. Now the girl was wondering how the Duke could so openly oppose Cybele, and what his reasons were. Why on earth was the ducal house in such a precarious position? After all, the ducal family was known for its long and loyal service to the royal family. The current Duke lacked influence, even sending his own daughter to the battlefield. Cybele knew very well that one day the Duke would betray him, and he was afraid of it. And at the center of all this scheming was Liliopa, who had openly rejected the crown prince. So the trouble she had caused was a real gift for Glock. Nevertheless, she knew she had to remain calm, because the Duke was part of Cybele's faction and supported him. The Duke was one of those superpowered individuals who could stand on equal footing with rivals from neighboring countries. Liliopa understood that for now. She had to be extremely careful with her words so as not to reveal her plans. Just then, the conversation returned to the engagement. Acten said that if he were to agree to such a thing, it would have to be his own choice, not a family decision. Liliopa couldn't be so direct, nor could she refuse the Duke to his face. So she tried to make him doubt that she was a good candidate for a daughter-in-law. Besides, a third awakening had never been recorded, so it was hard to draw any conclusions about her. Despite this, Glock didn't back down. He was willing to give the girl time to think it over until she graduated from the academy. Until then, he planned to dig up as much information as possible about this third awakening. More importantly, he let Liliopa choose one of his sons to be her future husband. This proposal was very unwelcome, as she had absolutely not thought of Cassiel in that way. The old man saw her hesitation and hinted that she'd be better off choosing Acteon. On the other hand, Acteon had no intention of putting any pressure on the girl. Unlike his father, Just then, the Duke gave his son some advice. Stick close to the girl, and she'll give in. That's how Siona became the lady of this house. Glock clearly wasn't worried that his wife hadn't come down today. He figured the head maid would take care of her, so there was no need to worry. After dinner, the girl returned to her room, completely unable to understand how the Crown Prince and Glock could be such terrible people. Liliopa couldn't figure out how the Duke could be so calm about the Crown Prince sending Acteon to the battlefield. Just then, her thoughts were interrupted by a secret note handed to her by a maid. This was another puzzling thing. Why the head maid would hand her a note and tell her to keep it secret. It was a note from the Duchess, asking to meet her at midnight. Liliopa couldn't wait to find out what Siona wanted from her, so she began her little trek to her room. So far, she had managed to avoid the staff patrolling the floors. And so, the girl reached the Duchess's room, which was incredibly dark. Honestly, the place was too gloomy for a woman's room. The smell was pungent and strange. The woman first apologized for summoning Liliopa in the middle of the night. Surprisingly, she wanted to talk about the Duke and his insistence on having Liliopa marry into their family. Liliopa immediately understood that the woman wanted to talk her out of it. She didn't deny it, saying this house was like a swamp you couldn't escape. Just like the girl who could have been her daughter's friend, who passed away, and even her kind and honest son was becoming more like his father every day. It was sad to see Cassiel losing his way, but lately, even he had been getting better. It was all thanks to Liliopa, just as Acteon had also come back to life recently. So today, she didn't want the girl to get mixed up with the ducal family. Besides, Siona was sure the duchy would soon be in jeopardy. Liliopa thanked the woman for her honesty, and now she understood they were in the same boat. This was a victory, especially after the girl had caused a major dispute between the duchy and the Crown Prince. Even if she hadn't intended to cause all this, she had lit the fuse for an explosion between these heavyweights. The two women began to finalize the terms of their deal. The Duchess promised to do everything she could for the girl, but there were some things she couldn't help with. Apparently, they needed to get her a new identity and find a way to get her out of here, as it was too dangerous to stay. But the Duchess had to understand that Liliopa's priority was her brother, so his safety would always come first. Siona heard her loud and clear and swore to protect Hyacinth at all costs. The conversation ended there, and Liliopa turned to leave. Just then, she spotted a cloaked figure in the hallway, someone who definitely shouldn't have been there. She recognized the scent. It was Beld. The biggest question was, where on earth had this apothecary been, showing up in the mansion so late? Dawn broke, and Liliopa felt terrible after following Beld all night. She then realized that now that she had sided with the Duchess, she had to be much more careful. First observation, the apothecary was quite skilled, so he prepared almost all the medicines for the ducal family and the household. This meant he was basically their doctor too, with access to every room and free reign to move around the whole damn place. Hopefully, he was on the Duchess's side, but who could be sure? The situation could be the complete opposite. He could be spying on all of them for the Duke. Since she didn't know what kind of person Beld really was, it was hard to draw any conclusions now. Since Liliopa was returning to the academy tomorrow, she needed to keep a close eye on the apothecary today. Just then, the head maid appeared. It turned out Siona had invited her for tea in the garden. The woman wanted to discuss some intelligence with the girl, which meant she could also ask whether Beld was an ally or an enemy. Except with Acteon hanging around the tea party, they might never get a chance to talk business. He was impeccably dressed, with a smile as bright as a spotlight. It turned out the guy was acting as Siona's informant to find out about the girl's preferences. But that was the end of the pleasantries. The Duchess admitted that she had invited the girl to her room that night. Acteon paused, but at the same time, he was relieved because he no longer had to keep secrets from her. In fact, Siona had beaten him to it, as he had also planned to lay his cards on the table soon. At that moment, the girl felt like a complete third wheel, as she had no idea what was going on. Just then, Beld approached them and asked if he could have a moment with Liliopa, as he needed to give her something. It was a small vial of medicine that needed to be delivered to Cassiel. Before going to the academy, the apothecary had given the lad the same medicine, but he had probably run out by now and needed a refill. Then he abruptly changed the subject, saying he had heard about all the trouble Acteon and Liliopa had caused in the city. The girl didn't deny it, but she didn't want to talk about it any further. Hearing this, the guy didn't stay any longer, as he had other things to do. Meanwhile, Siona suggested that Acteon continue their interesting conversation. Night fell, and Liliopa finally decided to spy on Beld. But she wasn't the only one who wanted to dig up some dirt on the guy. Her unexpected helper turned out to be Acteon, whom she tackled to the ground when he snuck up behind her. Liliopa froze, looking down at Acteon sprawled on the ground. The guy was embarrassed and asked her to get off him. If she didn't mind, the guy's getup with the mask just screamed suspicious, as if he wasn't just out for a walk. It was obvious he was tailing someone, but he was being too obvious about it, so she decided to adjust his disguise a bit. After all, she used to be a thief and knew a thing or two about blending in. But he didn't have to worry about her spilling the beans. Those days were long gone. Acteon understood, but what he didn't get was how she could remain so calm. For instance, when they met the Crown Prince, he had wanted to take him out right then and there, but he held back because he didn't want to give them more reason to treat the Awakened worse than they already did. It was already like that. To be honest, Liliopa felt the same way he did, but after going through a terrible ordeal, she realized that nothing is permanent. Everything changes, so she chose to wait and see for now. Her words made a lot of sense, especially considering the miracles that had already happened, things Acteon never thought possible. Liliopa suddenly realized she hadn't even asked the guy who he was following. It turned out Beld had been sneaking out at night a lot recently, and the Duchess had asked Acteon to keep an eye on him. Almost nothing was known about him either, only that the Duke had brought him home one day, and that was it. I'm curious. Obviously, trust is trust, but there might be another reason why the Duke brought the guy into his home. Soon, Beld arrived at a suspicious place. Liliopa guessed it was a place where weapons were privately bought, sold, and repaired. Acteon took a sniff. He smelled gunpowder and herbs. Just then, snippets of a conversation from inside drifted out, and Liliopa was shocked when she recognized the other voice as Prince Isidore's. The men were talking about the Duke's mansion and Acteon, who had only recently awakened. Although Beld didn't like it, he knew this day would eventually come. Meanwhile, Acteon listened with a strange sneer on his face. Listening to all this, overall, the prince was pleased with how things were going, since Acteon hadn't lost control. But then the guy suddenly walked to the window and threw it open. He didn't see anyone, though he suspected Beld might have brought some uninvited guests. Meanwhile, Acteon held Liliopa tightly, protecting her from the prince and from danger. The guy did the right thing, but why couldn't he look Liliopa in the eye? That was the real question. Suddenly, the kids overheard that Modin was about to be drafted, so everyone was getting ready to start training. When the time comes, Cybelin will throw anyone he doesn't like into the thick of it. That's why that problem was perfect for their plan, because before it could be discovered, it couldn't be stopped. Just then, the girl overheard something else that made her realize she had been used to get rid of Count Lorraine. The Crown Prince took over his business, and Isidore started playing his own game. She thought she was calling the shots, that she could change things only to be played for a fool. But that wasn't all for today's revelations. It turned out Isidore had a soft spot for Liliopa. He even felt like she had become his little sister. Beld was relieved that the prince hadn't fallen in love with her. Then the signal was lost, and Liliopa couldn't hear anything. Acteon, however, heard something, but he didn't tell her, only saying that they needed to leave. More importantly, his face seemed to be twisted in fear. A new day dawned, and they returned to the academy. But before leaving, Beld stopped her, even sending the maids away so they could talk. But as soon as Acteon approached them, the man backed away from her, his movements practically screaming how awkward he was. She had clearly missed something important in the man's behavior. There was a reason he was staying in the same house as the Duchess. And let's not forget about the draft. She had at least some training at the academy, but Acteon was completely inexperienced. Besides, she had to report in, and this time she was sure to face the consequences. But the conversation with the professor wasn't as bad as she thought. She was just glad the girl had returned to the academy safe and sound. There was no point in yelling at Liliopa, but the professor couldn't hide her disappointment. It felt strange to know the professor cared, especially since she had sent so many others to the front lines before. Just then, Hyacinth walked up to Liliopa. The professor had called him in for a talk. Hugging her brother reminded her that she needed to deliver that medicine to Cassiel. Except according to Hyacinth, that wasn't going to be easy right now. The guy had gotten into trouble for openly opposing the war. During history class, Liliopa looked around, hoping no one was close enough to hear. Still, She figured Cassiel must be somewhere nearby, buried in a book. They were punishing him, making him recopy things and write long reports, all to re-educate him and make him renounce his questionable beliefs. He was locked in a room near the library until he recognized the error of his ways. But if Liliopa wanted to see someone, she always found a way, even if it was strange or risky. A rational part of her told her she shouldn't get involved in this guy's troubles. But she couldn't just leave him high and dry. He needed his medicine, and she was going to get it to him. All right, she was almost there. She just had to open the window and get in. Just then, Cassiel opened the window himself. The guy was stunned because he knew very well that it was impossible to just waltz into this building. He tried to act casual, as if he wasn't rewriting reports, but just cooling off, and that he'd be out of here soon. But Liliopa wasn't buying it. After all, the guy couldn't control his temper. So she gave him the sedative she got from Belt. Besides, she also wanted to know how to remove this restrictive bracelet. Only now did she realize she had messed up, because for him, being sent to the front could be a trigger. Yes, Cassiel's face changed, realizing the Crown Prince was likely behind the girl's request. Oh God, he wished he could go back to a time when he hadn't seen or heard anything. Tears streamed down his face, because the same thing that happened to Claire was about to happen to Liliopa. They were the same rank. It was just too painful now. He didn't want to lose her. She had to live. Liliopa tried to calm him down, saying that even if she managed to escape, she'd be hunted for the rest of her life. Anyone who helped her would spend their life under the authorities' close watch. Besides, the war would end sooner or later, and she wanted to live to see that day. What she said made sense, especially about needing to get rid of that control stone. He had gathered intelligence on the control stones and kept it in his quarters, so he would hand it over as soon as he dealt with his own situation. This was good news. Also, she promised the guy she wouldn't kick the bucket. Time passed, and Acteon and Liliopa headed for Romdia. The day before, she had a huge fight with Hyacinth, who had found out about her draft notice from someone else. Acteon sensed her distress and tried to calm her down. He knew Hyacinth loved her very much, so he wouldn't stay mad for long and had probably already forgiven her. Just then, a guy reeking of danger and hostility approached them. Soon, they reached their destination. God, it was hot. He was drenched in sweat. He wanted to give Cybelin a piece of his mind and curse him to hell and back. Liliopa remembered the commander acting like an arrogant jerk. It was like that for the entire train journey. Then the train tracks were destroyed, and all the new recruits had to grab their packs and start marching. 4 days on end, we could only eat the rations we had packed. Everyone was wondering when on earth we would reach the camp. Even Acteon looked rough. Just then, the commander started bothering Liliopa again, saying that both he and his highness were counting on them. God, she was so close to, let's just say, she wanted to shut Cybelin up for good, and she knew her day would come. Finally, they arrived at the camp. Now, they just needed to find their tent and catch their breath. But to avoid any mistakes, Liliopa decided to double-check. She was right. She found the Awakened's tent right away, but the superior's attitude was strange and arrogant. Mitchell had to give them a tour of the camp, and he didn't look happy about it. The moment the guy heard their names, he was lost in thought. He was wondering how much Acteon knew about this place, but he quickly snapped out of it and told them to forget anything he said. Basically, this squad was made up of Awakened who specialized in black ops. The new recruits were given sleeping bags and could get a good night's sleep tonight, as it was supposed to be quiet for a while. Mitchell figured these guys probably hadn't slept the entire journey. After getting their sleeping bags, the boy and girl could sleep for a bit, and then they could talk about the situation later. After that, the guy hurried off to play cards with his buddies. But Liliopa wondered why those guys had just given up, and when the life of an Awakened had become such a mess. Night fell, and everyone was asleep, when suddenly Acteon sensed foreign magic and started waking his comrades. It was an attack, so the Awakened had to move out with the soldiers. But when Liliopa left the tent, she realized the camp was unervingly quiet. She didn't understand why only their squad was involved in this night raid. Mitchell explained that they were under attack by the Oscal Awakened Empire. More accurately, it was probably just one person, the Necromancer. The problem was that his magic could control the dead. We would be seeing dead animals and soldiers, so we couldn't let our guard down. The situation was terrible. Liliopa didn't understand why the cadets had to go through this. Just then, Mitchell called everyone over to take off their control bracelets. Once he takes it off, hide your bracelet and don't lose it, or you'll face disciplinary action. Then everything happened quickly. Liliopa had just taken a sip of Nexium when the first zombie attacked her. She was lucky because Acteon was faster and took the monster out before it could hurt her. She returned the favor, covering Acteon's back. So that was their plan, to cover each other's backs in battle. But then they noticed that almost everyone in the squad was barely using magic, just fighting off the zombies the old-fashioned way. This was super weird. I mean, the Academy taught us to use magic in these situations, but there was definitely something wrong here. Regular soldiers probably weren't sent on these missions anymore, as the Awakened handled the main affairs now. The situation on the battlefield became tense, depending on the rank of the Awakened sent for support. If they weren't using magic now, it meant there was something out there more terrifying than these zombies. To find out what it was, we had to end this fight. All in all, the boy and girl worked together like a well-oiled machine. But it was time to end this fight, and Acteon decided to take charge. What he did next seemed completely insane to everyone else. He wiped out the horde of zombies in a single blow, completely stunning everyone with his power. Even the enemy stopped using magic. The other Awakened started talking about Acteon, bringing up Claire again. A few minutes later, the lad announced that there were no more enemies around. Mitchell could see that for himself, as the lad had taken them all out on his own. Just then, Acteon noticed Mitchell looking at him strangely and asked what that was about. But the guy didn't answer, just ordered everyone to put on their bracelets and go back to the barracks to sleep. Acteon and Liliopa put on their bracelets, thinking there was probably a reason why everyone was so cautious about using magic. After the first battle, there were several more attacks over the next few days. The Necromancer didn't show up again, but the enemy kept trying to test Acteon's limits. The lad was good at playing along with them, so they quieted down pretty quickly. The guys in the squad even told him to take it easy, saying they would praise and love him all the same even if he didn't go all out.